So we're going to look at Habakkuk this morning. But before we do, what I want you to do is a thought experiment with me. I want you to imagine right now the very best circumstance you can possibly think of occurring in your life. Now, whether you're 7 or 70, I want you to think through that right now. What is the very best possible circumstance that you can imagine occurring in your life? You guys, are the wheels turning? Anything is coming to mind? I mean, perhaps you're thinking of things like generational wealth. You can have a home with all the amenities. You can travel. You can make a difference, actually, with your generosity. Maybe those are your dreams of, man, this is the best circumstance. Or perhaps you're thinking of business success. Perhaps I want to work in a job that I actually like. Perhaps my health. I just want to have fantastic health. Wouldn't it be great to be able to get up, move, and not worry about the struggles of health complications? Perhaps for you, the best circumstance would be that you have a unique, fulfilling ability. I mean, I wish I could play the guitar, Gene. I do. Or perhaps it's an intellectual, academic ability that would just make it for you. Or maybe it's just this. Maybe your best circumstance would be to have loving and loyal friendships. So, yeah, somebody's still wanting to play in the NFL. I can see that. That's good. So, if you got that, whatever's gone through your head as your best, how would you respond to it? Yeah, there we go. I see it. I can actually look around the room and see the smiles on your faces. I see the raising of the fist, like, yeah. I mean, there'd be this happy, I've got a smile, I can't stop. I'm turning cartwheels, I'm skipping. There'd be excitement, and actually you would then go forward probably into your day with like, I'm going to give the very best effort I've got. Now, let's flip it on its head. Imagine the worst circumstance possible in your life. Imagine something like poverty. And I don't mean just like I don't have enough to go buy season tickets to the Hurricanes. I'm talking about destitution. My boss actually at my place of work actually ran into a gentleman who is from Brazil who was sleeping in a tent. And he came here, had 3 months worth of work, and for the last 3 months he's had no work, and he's in a process of going back to Brazil. I mean, this man has nothing. Perhaps for you it would be failure in your business life. Or maybe it is having a miserable job and there's no way out. Maybe it would be chronic or debilitating health. Or maybe it would just be the sense that I'm good for nothing. I'm inadequate, I'm unaccomplished, and I'm not able to change that. Or maybe it's as simple as this, the feeling of abandonment. The worst thing that could occur for you would be for you to be left alone or for you to be abused in some way, shape, or form. So the same question to follow that up. Whatever's going through your head on your worst circumstance, how would you respond to that? I don't see any smiles on our faces. Disappointment would set in, would it not? Probably anxiety. For some of us, left in that state long enough, frustration and bitterness would probably arise within our souls. And we may even work it out where what we do is lash out at others because we're so disappointed in this circumstance that's around me. As I've looked at Habakkuk and thought through Habakkuk over the past several weeks, I had this thought go through my head yesterday that I feel like my responses are often more like Jonah than they are like Habakkuk. Which emphasizes this: Habakkuk's story may help inform us as to how to live out our own story. You know, last week We saw Habakkuk in a problem that he was facing. He was distraught over his own people's injustice and their twisting of the covenant that God had given them in order to justify their injustice. And as he pointed that out, and he gets the answer from God that I'm going to use the Babylonians, there's a disillusionment that comes as he considers the fact that God is going to use the Babylonians, this pagan, ruthless, law unto themselves and proud of it people, to actually bring judgment on his covenant people. It's only going to be about 2 decades after Habakkuk gets this word from the Lord, an answer from him about the usage of the Babylonians to bring judgment on Israel before Jerusalem would be sacked. And Solomon's glorious temple would be in ruins. And the best among the people would actually be picked up and deported to Babylonia. In exile, they would have to go serve idolaters, serve people who denied the God who truly is. So if you're Habakkuk and you're in that scenario, how do you deal with that? How do you respond to that? I mean, the result in his circumstance is not victory, it's defeat. It's not success, it's actually humiliation. It's not clarity, it's uncertainty. It's uncertainty about every detail, about the hardship that's coming, and then you're asking me to trust in the midst of this. Habakkuk's response is actually given to us today in the 3rd chapter of his prophecy. It's a prayer. It's a prayer that ends with a surprising perspective. I'm going to lay out for you just real quickly maybe like a statement that's going to capture what he ends up with as his perspective, and it is this. Though it is as bad as I can imagine, I will choose joy in you. For the future and for the present struggle. I'm going to read that one more time. Though it's as bad as I can imagine, I will choose joy in you. For the future and for the present struggle. Just so you can know where we're going with that this morning, there's 3 quick points that we're going to see in chapter 3 that support that premise. Number 1, we're going to see how in the prayer Habakkuk is asking us to face where you are, to be real. We're then going to move on to look at, he says, choose how you respond, be joyful. And then lastly, remember why you can be joyful and be strong. So face where you are, be real, choose how you respond, be joyful, remember why you can be strong. So let's just start there at the first of Habakkuk's prophecy in chapter 3 and think through that first point. Face where you are. Be real. Look at verse 17 that Gwendolyn read for us earlier. It says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. This is a description of utter destitution. It's an agrarian society, and all of these conditions laid out are conditions that speak to famine and ultimately to death. Why does he present this worst case scenario in his kind of concluding statement to the whole prophecy that's going to give us perspective? Why does he just juxtapose this absolute destitution to the resolve that we're going to hear in the next point, in verse 18? I want to think through chapter 3 and his prayer and see where he takes us. First of all, He can face what's real because he actually heard. Look at verse 2. He starts by saying, "O Lord, I have heard the report of you." He's going to go through a lot in his prayer and finish up the concluding portion of his prayer in verse 16 where he says, "I hear." Look, for Habakkuk, there's no denial of what's real. There's no qualifying. There's no trying to reinterpret the scenario and the circumstance that he's facing. There's not a dismissal of the impact that it's actually going to have on him and on his people. The events of chapter 1, verses 6 through 11 are clear that God is going to bring this ruthless people, the Babylonians, to execute judgment upon the people. They're heard by Habakkuk and they are understood by Habakkuk. You know, the reality is Paul actually speaks to us of speakers or prophets, as they would have been in the Old Testament, who actually enjoy tickling the ears of their hearers, which is a great little visual picture, is it not? It's giving them what they want to hear, not what is real. See, this is a statement of judgment. It's not something that's desired, but it's a warning that's necessary. So it would be similar to this. Let's suppose that you had cancer in your body right now. A horrible circumstance, right? And you went to the doctor, and the doctor actually could diagnose it, saw it, but never told you about it. If he did, you would be left in a delusional state of okayness. But Habakkuk doesn't do that. He comes in here, God to Habakkuk doesn't do that. He comes and gives him what's real about the circumstance in which he is going to have to live. The second thing that we see here as a reason for him to put forward this real scenario of destitution is that he feared. Not only did he hear what was real, but he feared what was real. So taking the cancer diagnosis, let's suppose the doctor actually does tell you what's going on inside. What's going to be your emotional and visceral response? Are you going to go skipping out of the room? No. You're going to come out realizing that this diagnosis equals consequences, hardship, difficulty. And it brings about an internal emotional response, does it not? You can hear it there. He says in verse number 2 that he has heard of his work, and because of it, he fears. Look at how he sums it up in verse 16. He says, "I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones." Do you get the sense? It's deep inside. My legs tremble beneath me. You know, spiritually, we face this, every one of us. There's a reality that looms over us. It's a reality that the Scriptures refer to as sin. Sin simply means missing the mark. It's falling short. And spiritually, it means you fall short of God's glory. And when you do fall short of God's glory, God's expectation, God's perfection, then the consequences are glum. You realize I'm supposed to be there and I can't get there. And all of a sudden, your sense of self-sufficiency is done away with. Your self-righteousness becomes a mirage that you now see through. But the fact of the matter is, we need to hear the honest assessment of where we are. And it's only in, hold on to this, it's only in hearing the honest assessment that freedom from that sin and shortcoming is possible. So Habakkuk's response is encouraging you and me. Listen. Hear what's real. Hear what's true. And then don't just hear it as some intellectual fact to assent to, but then synthesize what you hear. Take it and be in awe. For it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So point number one is face where you are. Be real. And Habakkuk is doing that in his prayer. The second point that he is going to give us in his perspective is choose how you respond. Be joyful. Look at verse 18. He says, though all of these things occur in verse 17 that are destitution, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Again, let me emphasize, reality is intellectual and mental assent, but reality then elicits an emotional and visceral feeling. And what Habakkuk is telling us is that his feeling turns out to be joy. So just think about that for a second. Joy? Does that make any sense to you? It's horrible out there, guys, and I want you to be happy. Everything in there just says, no way, this is not a natural feeling or a natural response for me. So I have to ask myself at a point, is Habakkuk a lunatic asking all of us to jump on the crazy train with him? I mean, is he delusional in his response? So let's pause and realize that when he says, I will rejoice, I will take joy, and understand this, that joy is a choice. Joy here is a choice, and he's making this choice out of the context of the whole. So pause with me and think. Fear is a natural response that he's had. It's not like joy in oblivion. It's joy with full understanding of both what's real and what the consequences are. This fear that he has is a response and a reaction, even dread, and it makes sense. We see it there. But his recognition here is that fear need not paralyze. And there's two key ways that he can take this horrible situation and feel the fear and yet not be paralyzed. And it's all through the prayer. Here are the things that you can do when you fear to end up choosing what is joyful. Number one, remember. Verses 3 through 15, which is the majority of the prayer. There's 15 verses in the prayer, and 13 verses are given to remembering God's justice in the past. If you look at it, he ends up starting with God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran. These are areas in the south. They actually start to reflect upon, Paran is that often equated with Mount Sinai, and all of a sudden what he's going to do is he says, all right, I'm in this bad situation now. I can think back and remember the exodus that occurred for my people in the past. This whole passage is just full of these remembrances from Egypt to Sinai and the deliverance of the covenant that's given to the people where they are delivered from slavery. You can see it in that next verse where his brightness was like light and rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Do you remember how Moses goes on the mountain? He wants to see the Lord, and the Lord says, you can't stand to see me. Even here, I'm going to have to shield you and just let you see the afterglow. So he's remembering all of this stuff that occurred. Verse 5, he ends up talking about the fact that before him went pestilence and plague followed at his heels. And you can all of a sudden, if you're thinking through the Exodus, you remember what happens in Egypt before they leave, right? All sorts of plagues, all sorts of problems where God brought his justice upon a people who had held them in slavery for a 400-year period, or the better part of that 400 years. And it was unjust what they were doing. They were conscripting them in labor. They were committing infanticide and killing their male children so that they could maintain their power. And yet God comes with pestilence and with plagues, and he stands there and he levels the playing field. The Lord all through this is marching forward. And it's not just the Exodus. There's one part of the passage in verse 11 where he talks about the sun and the moon stood still in their place. Do you remember the story with Joshua? Where Joshua's at battle, and in battle he doesn't have time to finish, and the Lord stops the sun and the moon and gives him time to finish the job in the day, to bring judgment upon the people who had been oppressing God's people. So this whole process is Habakkuk remembering that, Lord, you know what? I'm in a hard spot. You're getting ready to bring Babylonian captivity upon my people. How is it that I can have joy in this? Well, the first thing I can do is remember that in the past, even when he used horrible people to bring judgment on his own people, he actually ends up judging them as well. And through the judgment delivers his people. Verse 13, you went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. This remembering is important. And in the Old Testament, it often centers around the Exodus event. But you and I, now past the Old Testament, we have the opportunity to remember when things are hard. And our remembrance, it races to the cross. We can think that when we are put in a hard spot of Jesus, in the hard spot he was in, and the judgment that he took in order to free us. Listen to this in Hebrews chapter 12. We're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. He's remembered all these Old Testament saints who by faith trusted God when it was hard. And he says, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. By faith in this God who's delivered in the past, I can count on him for deliverance in my present. So the first way in which you can take this seemingly paradoxical call to be joyful when it's horrible is to remember. The second thing he says in his prayer is to do this: quietly wait. You can see it there in verse number 16. It concludes his prayer by saying this: yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Do you hear the forward-looking thing? It's not I'm waiting for the trouble like it's the shoe's about to drop on me, but instead, God, you're going to do what's right. And the ones who are going to invade us that need judgment as well, I'm going to wait for you to bring that to pass. Now, let me ask you guys a question. How many of you like to wait? You like to wait? I didn't think so. I don't like to wait. And you know what? I especially don't like waiting for justice when I've been violated. Do you? No. There's a reason that we look out in society and we see vigilante justice, that we see riots, that we see burning, that we see unlawful entry. It's not just because of wanting to tear up and destroy. Much of it arises from a sense of I want to see the right done at some level. But rather than waiting on the authorities and rather than waiting on due process and rather than waiting for fair trial, I take the law into my own hands. So I'm going to go bring it to pass. I want to encourage you, when you're feeling that just rage coming up and that desire to just go make it happen, Remembrance of God's goodness and his justice in the past allows for patience, which is a part of the fruit of the Spirit. It allows for patience to then be in my present. And the full flower of this remembering and of this waiting is joy. I read to you Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. Let me finish that up. You're surrounded with this great cloud of witnesses, but now he says, look to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. He despised the shame. It's not like some delusional, like I'm happy, I'm a masochist, let me just beat me up. No. He endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated now at the right hand of the throne of God. Joy can come because of remembering God's faithfulness in the past and making the choice to wait upon him to bring these things to their fruition. Quick question. Would those around you, watching you in your everyday life, some of your lives which are hard, would they describe you as joyful? To be real, remember, let's face what's real. Would they describe you as joyful? If you have a hint of maybe not, perhaps we should think through some of these helps that Habakkuk is giving us here, where he's heard what's real and true and hard, and yet he's remembered the faithfulness of God in the past. That's drawn him to say, I'll wait upon the Lord to do it in the present. That allows him to have joy as he considers what will be the future. So, face where you are, be real. Choose how you respond, be joyful. And that leads us to the third point, rest in why you can do so. Be strong. Look at verses 18 and 19 here. I will rejoice in the Lord. All caps, Yahweh, covenant name of God. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, all lowercase, Adonai, Master Sovereign, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. Two quick observations from these two monikers of God that we see in verse 18 and verse 19. Verse 18, as I said, Lord. You see it there in all caps in your Bible. The reason is because it is a translation of the covenant name of God. He is referenced in that context as the God of salvation. And here's what you can take from that. You are not forgotten if you are his. His covenant promise secures that you will be taken care of, that you will be carried to the end. I wish we could use this illustration in a scenario where it was more faithfully carried out. But it's not that dissimilar to the covenant between a husband and a wife that causes the husband, when he's away, to not forget his wife, to not live as though she's not important or doesn't matter, and actually stay faithful to his wife. God is faithful, never abandons, never betrays, never forgets. So, number one, you are not forgotten. And secondly, because of this covenant nature of God's relationship with you and me through Christ, you're not doomed. I mean, covenant promise entails rescue. You see it right there in verse 13 where it said, again, I'll read it again, you went out for the salvation of your people. That's the reason God brought judgment, for the salvation of your anointed. He will care for you as his, and there's even this hint here in this time before our Lord Jesus comes. of the provision of the Anointed One. And the fact that our ultimate rescue will be procured through him. So first and foremost observation is there's a covenant name of God there. He is going to care for you as his own. But secondly, in verse 19, he is referenced in this way. God, the Lord, is my strength. Again, that word Lord, Adonai, is a term that refers to master or sovereign. We hear it referred to others. But this is the ultimate sovereign. We need to take this from that, I believe. The one over all is over the circumstance you're in, even if it's mighty Babylon. And that one is your collective as a church and your individual as a person strength. Let that sink in. The conquest of your circumstance is not dependent upon your finite strength. It actually rests upon the infinite one. So phrases that might come at you like suck it up or have a stiff upper lip, they may have some practical significance in a moment, but they only sustain and support when the initiative is to lean into God and not into self. I mean, that's the problem with the Babylonians, is that their pride is in their own might. Habakkuk is leaning into the God who is almighty. The New Testament puts it this way: I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in this flesh, like this moment, this present situation and circumstance, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. What is this nature of a God who is covenantly connected and sovereign and almighty? What benefits are there in that? Number one, strength. What does it say here? God, the Lord, is my strength. That word actually carries the idea of ability or force, and it actually is often used in terms of military or army-type conquest. And that's ironic, is it not, here where the Babylonians are getting ready to absolutely destroy you? And yet I'm going to reference that God is my military strength here. All strength in me is associated with my connection and my identification with him. Second benefit is stability. That phrase at the end of verse 19, he makes my feet like the deer's, he makes me tread on my high places. Do we have any deer hunters in here? You're familiar with deer hunters, right? Well, let me ask it this way. You're familiar with deer, right? There's a contrast here about steady feet, and it uses the deer as the illustration. It's kind of the opposite of what you would see if you went and read Psalm 73, where the psalmist is focused on the pride of his oppressor and the ill-gotten gain. His focus is down here, and it says in Psalm 73, as for me, my feet had almost stumbled. My steps had nearly slipped. So when focus is there, I'm going to lose it. And yet, this states, when God is my strength, that my feet will be secure like the deer's. There's actually a deer in Palestine, in Israel. It's called the mountain gazelle. This particular animal is graceful and swift and sure-footed. He has the ability to climb sheer rock cliffs as if they're nothing. He's able to scamper across them. Even terrain, which, Gene, I know you're a rock climber, but terrain that seems impassable, these guys can just scamper up them with no fear of stumbling, no fear of falling. The scripture is full of imagery of God who is omnipresent, but it uses imagery often if he's in a high place. Remember, where does Moses go to get the commandments? He goes to the mountain. Where does Jesus go and is transfigured? It's up on the mountain. So there's often this imagery of God is in that high place. Promise and provision of strength and ultimate joy, it can be mine. If I'm in covenant with the sovereign Lord and he will draw me close to him, up into that high place, I can confidently go to where he is. No fear of judgment, no fear of rejection. All of the judgment has been carried out on Christ, on the cross. And now we can go boldly to him. As the deer, who's not an aggressive predator, he can go to that place where the Lord is, who is his strength, who is his provider, who is his protector. Man, that is a fantastic place to be. Circumstance, you lose your power to take away my surety and my strength and my joy when I understand that the Lord is my salvation and the sovereign is my strength. I'm going to close with this. When I was in high school, I went to a small Christian school and had a Bible class. And the guy who was our teacher one of those years, he was actually grew up as a missionary kid in South America. And he would end up reading for us once a week from this 20th century allegory. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of it, but it was called Hind's Feet in High Places. Hind's feet, hind is actually a synonym of deer. It comes from this very passage. The name of this particular allegory is the story of this fearful little girl who comes from a fearful people. And yet she's given herself to this loving chief shepherd. She longs to be like him, to lose her limp, to lose the disfigurement of her face. There's a line in this particular allegory that catches the sentiment, I believe, that I'd love to close our time with today. So just if you will, bear with me, listen to this as to the perspective that we can have. Therefore, this is the actual allegory. And this is the girl. Her name was Much Afraid, and it turns to Grace and Glory. Her name is changed. Therefore, I begin to think, my Lord, you purposefully allow us to be brought into contact with the bad and evil things you want changed. Perhaps that is the very reason that we are here in this world, where sin and sorrow and suffering and evil abound, so that we may let you teach us how to react to them. That out of them, we can create lovely qualities to live forever. That is the only really satisfactory way to deal with evil. Not simply binding it so that it cannot work harm, but whenever possible, overcoming it with good. So, dear precious people of South Durham, I want to encourage you. Be real. Be joyful. And be strong. Because you can count on this, that though it's as bad as you can imagine, you also can choose joy for your future and for your present struggle.